Chapter 6, Policing Satanism, Great Britain. We should not perhaps be unduly hard on Inspector Aston. Satanism is, quite rightly, not in itself a crime in Great Britain, though satanic groups do enjoy the constitutional protection and tax-exempt status of the American counterparts. Inevitably, that has led the law enforcement community to regard such groups as off limits for any intelligence gathering or activity monitoring. Were Satanism a conventional religion, this respect for its adherents' civil liberties might be admirable. But as we have seen in previous chapters, the history of satanic worship is inextricably bound up with the commission of serious criminal offenses, offenses which all too often require children as their victims. Conventional law enforcement wisdom, in the United States as well as in Britain, puts forward a double-barreled justification of its stubborn refusal to study the history and incidents of satanic crime. The expert most usually cited in this context is Ken Lanning of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. Quote, "The law enforcement effort must focus on crime and clearly recognize that just because an activity is satanic does not necessarily mean it is a crime. Bizarre crime and evil can occur without organized satanic activity. The law enforcement perspective requires that we distinguish between what we know and what we're not sure of." Close quote. Lanning's cautious approach might at first seem sensible, particularly in light of the muscular campaign by organized Christian groups to hijack ritual crime seminars and divert detection along purely religious lines. Put simply, the Lanning line amounts to the following reassurance, quote, "Crime is crime. The motivation doesn't matter," close quote. Furthermore, he suggests that whatever the religious affiliation of an organized criminal cult, law enforcement officials will inevitably be able to deal with it without recourse to specialist investigators. Quote, "If and when members of a destructive cult commit murders, they are bound to make mistakes, leave evidence, and eventually make admissions in order to brag about their crimes or to reduce their legal liability. The discovery of the murders in Matamoros, Mexico in April 1989, and the result of the subsequent investigation are good examples of these dynamics," close quote. Lanning's reference is revealing. Rather than supporting his analysis, Matamoros in fact reveals its fundamental flaw. That spring, a number of adolescent American youths were abducted, killed, stewed, and eaten before police got onto the case. By relying on reactive policing, Lanning is tacitly admitting that his blueprint amounts to mopping up blood rather than adequate crime prevention. And there's a footnote here. This is less surprising than its source might suggest. Respected American child welfare charities, such as Defense for Children International, have repeatedly attacked Lanning's child abuse theories as dangerously cautious. End of footnote. It also flies in the face of established law enforcement practice worldwide. All major police organizations accept that specialist squads constantly gathering intelligence are vital to prevent the commission of serious offenses. Drugs, terrorism, even football hooliganism are now accorded this special threat status. That child abuse or pedophilia, whatever its motivation, does not generally merit such attention is inexplicable. Only in America has there been even the most modest attempt at creating specialist national abuse teams. And yet the second plank of the conventional law enforcement approach to ritual crime is based, particularly in Britain, on the assumption that such expertise does not exist and that this will be enough to police the limited incidents of satanic abuse. The reality is depressingly different. The structure of British law enforcement actively works against the successful prosecution of most child sexual abuse offenses. British police forces are almost entirely regionally organized, funded, and operated. With rare exceptions, drugs and terrorism being the two most notable examples, Even neighboring forces do not cooperate on the day-to-day problems of policing, much less on issues of wider public policy. What that means is the isolated pools of experience build up, but remain cut off from the vast majority of detectives and uninformed officers. In the 8 years since Chief Superintendent David Cole successfully prosecuted Britain's first case of ritual abuse, he has not been invited to address one conference on the issue of satanic crime. Quote, unless you actually stumble across one of these offenses, as I did, then you, as an ordinary copper, never get to find out about them. That can be a fairly rare experience, and it is quite likely that many policemen don't know what to look for when confronted with a crime which is possibly satanically motivated. When I was working on the Newell homicide case, not only did it receive a lot of publicity nationally, but all forces were circulated with the details. I asked in that circular for any officer with similar experience to contact me. I had very little response. Close quote. Of course, the possibility exists that the reason why Chief Superintendent Cole received such a small response is that very little satanic or ritual crime exists. That, as we shall see shortly, has been the subject of a heated debate inside the American law enforcement community. As with any crime, however, statistics are only as good as the skills of those who investigate and record it. As Cole, by no means a satanic fanatic, was to admit, it is at the very least, quote, a possibility, close quote, that detectives untrained in the nature of ritual crime fail to recognize it when they investigate bizarre incidents. Perhaps the best analogy stems from the David, son of Sam Berkowitz case in America. To law enforcement officers in New York, California, and the Midwest, the piles of dead and mutilated dogs covered regularly between 1969 and 1978 were no more than that, mounds of unpleasant animal carcasses. But what Berkowitz knew and subsequently explained to Maury Terry was that those dead dogs were, in some cases at least, the trademark of a satanic cult, and one which was ultimately responsible for a number of human killings. The first relevant paper survey of police records throughout Britain suggests that ritual abuse occurs in one of every 40 recorded cases of child sex rings, organized networks distinguished from other cases because they involve either multiple perpetrators or multiple victims. The study was carried out in October 1990 on behalf of a BBC documentary examining the incidence of organized child sexual abuse. It involved 186 proven cases of such networked molestation and appeared to show only 5 in which there were claims of ritual or satanic abuse. The problem with the survey, even though it showed for the first time a discernible level of satanic abuse cases on police files, was twofold. Firstly, as we have seen, there is a considerable doubt that detectives or uninformed officers in Britain would invariably recognize or record such satanic claims. Natalie's case. It had reached a successful prosecution, but would not have been entered on the ritual abuse statistics. The second flaw was in the basis of the survey itself. Such was the attitude of British police forces that only 2/3 of the 52 individual forces throughout Britain bothered to reply. Nor is there any nationwide unit for this vital intelligence work. Britain's only police squad maintaining any form of intelligence on any form of organized pedophilia, ritual or not, is the Obscene Publications branch of the Metropolitan Police. Its operational head, Superintendent Mick Hames, is attempting to have logged on a localized computer database all the intelligence information that his men receive. A frank, open, and genuinely committed man, Hames readily admits that organized child sex rings are far more common than current statistics reveal. Hames should know his men have a 20-year backlog of casework, growing by the way, and with no prospect of compiling a reliable and nationally accessible database of their information for several years. But Hames also knows that his teams work almost exclusively in London. Outside the capital, there is no similar work undertaken. Ironically, the mechanisms and logistics exist to research and log such findings. Although Britain does not have an equivalent of the FBI's behavioral science unit, one internal law enforcement organization does attempt to keep abreast of trends within policing policy. The Association of Police Chief Officers of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the ACPO, was formed in 1948 and mounts conferences, seminars, and training workshops throughout the UK. It has nearly 300 individual members, all very senior serving officers. ACPO has begun to build a body of research into the issue of satanic ritual crime, but it has found stumbling blocks even within its own membership. In the summer of 1989, one ACPO researcher complained, quote, "I've been trying to get data out of a number of forces, but I keep getting the knockback. It's not that they haven't heard of the problem, or in some cases that they haven't got it. It's just that they don't want to tell anyone," close quote. Almost a year later, this attitude was reflected and confirmed by a senior London detective in one of the Metropolitan Police's 8 API AMIPs, Area Major Investigation Pools, which handle all potentially troublesome cases of murder and rape. Quote, "Sure, we've got ritual abuse cases on our files. We've got ritual murders there too. But we won't say that publicly. This subject is not for discussion. End of story." Close quote. For whatever reason, and there is no clearly definable motive, many police forces throughout Britain are extremely reluctant to accept evidence of ritual crime. One result of this has been an isolation of therapists handling such cases. Since the Butler-Schloss report, much emphasis has been placed on the maintenance of good relations between social services department child safety workers and their opposite numbers in the local police force. This has, on occasions, become a shibboleth, a sacred cow preserved at the expense of damaging children. According to Pam Hudson, local authority therapists she met on a British lecture tour in 1988 were simply unable to progress existing cases of ritual abuse through the multidisciplinary machinery. Quote, "At each meeting I did, social workers came up afterwards and said, 'Hey, I've had a case of ritual abuse, but I couldn't do anything with it.' These weren't people suddenly thinking that ritual abuse might fit a particular case after hearing my lecture. They were trained workers with existing caseloads. Now, okay, there weren't dozens of them saying this, and this was only a small sample, but I think Great Britain has a problem and it needs to wake up to it." Close quote. In part, the problem that law enforcement has with ritual abuse cases is that the vast majority of testimony comes from very young children. Although the 1988 Criminal Justice Act formally abolished the convention that children's testimony had to be corroborated by other evidence in court, many judges and local CPS offices still regard it as suspect and refuse to rely on it alone. Children are still deemed to be unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. But how valid is that view? Children are certainly suggestible. That is, ideas can be imprinted on their minds as reality when they are, in fact, fictional. A survey by the Broadcasting Standards Council in October 1990 showed that a sample survey of 6 to 9-year-olds in Leeds, drawn from a wide and representative socioeconomic background, failed to distinguish between reality and fantasy in TV soap operas. More disturbingly, they also exhibited frequently low comprehension of what they saw on screen and failed to differentiate accurately between goodies and baddies. But the BSC survey only covered images presented to the children on a television screen, not events which they had actually experienced at first hand. Academic and clinical studies show that children have highly accurate recall events in which they have been involved. When these events are traumatic, the recalling of them frequently causes the children extreme distress. The way in which a child discloses abuse can be as important in determining the veracity of the story as the words spoken. Put simply, the worse the experience being described, the more visibly painful will be its disclosure. We saw in Chapter 1 that the British Psychological Society now accepts that children's evidence in sexual abuse cases tends to be reliable rather than inaccurate. In September 1990, an independent study by two academic psychologists supported that conclusion. Dr. Jim Baxter of Strathclyde University and Professor Graham Davies of Leicester University studied the recall powers of two groups of children. Each group comprised 20 boys and girls. The first was made up of 7-year-olds, the second of 11-year-olds. The children were asked to watch a mock-up theft from a car and then to sit down and construct a fantasy story based loosely on what they had witnessed. 4 days later, the psychologists asked them to remember the details of the incident itself, separating them from the fantasies they had woven around it. The results showed that although some small elements of fantasy remained in the final versions, every child recalled accurately the salient points of the theft itself. To Dr. Baxter, the implication for the legal presumption that children's imaginations makes their evidence of sexual abuse or any other crime suspect was clear. Quote, "No one has looked to see if that is true, but I am not saying that 7-year-old children are as reliable as adults, but they should not automatically be regarded as unreliable. It should be left to the common sense of a jury." Close quote. So much for the academic view. What then are the ground rules under which children's testimony of sexual or ritual abuse are considered by police and therapists? Until the publication of the Butler-Schloss report in 1988, both, in theory, worked to a set of guidelines issued in 1986 by the Department of Health. Quote, "A child's statement that he or she is being abused should be accepted as true until proven otherwise. Children seldom lie about sexual abuse." Close quote. The controversy surrounding Cleveland's discovery of widespread child sexual abuse made a revision of that principle a political inevitability. After Butler-Schloss, the Department of Health guidelines stated merely that a child's disclosure of sexual abuse should always, quote, "be taken seriously," close quote. The reason for this delusion was a public perception that pediatricians and social workers in Cleveland had been too quick to accept not simply a child's statement that he or she was being abused, but that the abuser was a parent. The fact that this perception, fanned by irresponsible and breathtakingly inaccurate press reporting, was a complete fantasy meant nothing. The belief was abroad that social workers operated a strict and simplistic policy of, quote, "always believe the child," close quote. Professor John Newson, director of the Child Development Center at Nottingham University, summed up this newly skeptical view in the summer of 1990. Quote, "You've got to listen very carefully and treat seriously anything the child says. But there are still professionals who think everything a child says should be believed, and that is a very dangerous point of view. You've got to treat it with the greatest possible caution. There are at least some children who are completely unreliable witnesses and will say anything. Others are persuaded to tell a story to indict someone for adult reasons, for example, in divorce cases," close quote. On what did Professor Newsom base this radically opposing view of children's reliability in sexual abuse cases? In part, he was quoting American research, which appears to show that substantially more false allegations are made in divorce and child custody cases, but not child abuse cases, than in any other type of litigation. But his most recent research, and certainly his formative personal experience, was as a consultant to an inquiry team investigating the handling of the Nottingham ritual abuse case. As we shall see in Chapter 7, that inquiry, indeed Professor Newsom's role in it, was less than scientific in its approach. Before we examine the Nottingham case, however, we need to place the British experience in some form of international context. If police in the United Kingdom are skeptical or obstructive and social workers isolated and under attack, how have other nation states coped with the reporting of satanic ritual abuse? Children's evidence, Holland. Holland has, for more than 25 years, adopted a distinctly ambivalent approach to all aspects of child sexual abuse. The Dutch government was among the first to allow commercial trading in child pornography and amongst the last to outlaw it. At the same time, its social services and welfare policies have been largely supportive of children's legitimate demands for human rights. This relaxed and liberal approach has, however, led to a devalued perception of the damage caused by child sexual abuse. The ultimate, and in some ways logical, end result was the effective abandoning in 1990 of sexual consent laws once children passed the age of 12. Although carried through the Dutch parliament for the best and most practical of motives, it is not without justification that the liberalizing statute has been dubbed a pedophile's charter. The response of both the Justice Department in The Hague and the police forces in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, whenever foreign politicians or journalists have questioned Holland's policy on child sexual abuse, has been invariably one of unrestrained antagonism. Against this background, it was not, perhaps, surprising that the Oude Pekela ritual abuse disclosures received distinctly short shrift. According to Dr. Fred Jonkers, quote, the attitude of certain Dutch officials, in public and without having taken the time to speak with the children, the parents, or the experts, was denial and rejection, dismissal of the children's stories because of their bizarre nature. Yet we know that the phenomenon of ritual abuse was not a rarity. One of Finkelhorst's studies showed that there were signs of ritual abuse in 13% of the cases involving sexually abused children in daycare centers in the United States. Furthermore, there are undeniable similarities between a number of noted cases in Oude Pekela in May 1987 and various cases in America. But when we suggested the possibility of satanic rituals being involved here, even the concerned public prosecutor replied, quote, just because it happens in the States doesn't mean that it happens here, close quote. From the outset, the official reaction to the Oude Pekela disclosures were loftily dismissive. Although a major police investigation was launched immediately after Jonkers reported his suspicions of a possible sex ring, it lacked both political support and expert advice. Quote, not all the children were medically examined. For example, the Justice Department didn't retain a child psychiatrist until 6 weeks after the police had begun their inquiry, and even this was partially due to pressure from the media. This initial attitude of the judicial authorities also led to reports in the press suggesting mass hysteria. Often judicial officials were cited as the source of the reports. The result was that the major discussion was about the phenomenon of mass hysteria and not on the issue of child sexual abuse. Yes, the Oude Pekela affair received much attention. Outrage was there, but also direct denial in the press. Parents were made out to be subject to this mass hysteria and to be fanatic porno hunters who only wanted to stir up the whole matter. It became a struggle against disbelief, both for the involved physicians and for the criminal investigation team versus the public prosecutor. The final outcome was that while on the one hand, there were many parents, social workers, police officers, and members of the general public who believed the children's stories, there were, on the other hand, a large number of people who ascribed the stories to the children's fantasies, close quote. It is worth reminding ourselves of some of the key details of these fantasies. The Udapakela children, largely independently, described being abused by a large number of adults who chanted in a strange language. Sometimes the adults dressed up as clowns, other times as lions and bears. The children claimed that these mysterious adults walked around the children in a circular dance, tied them up or locked them in cages. They forced the children to eat feces and drink urine or blood. Drugs were administered and babies mutilated or killed. Cameras had captured much of this on film or video. If the public prosecutor was skeptical about the links with overseas cases of ritual abuse, the remarkable similarity between the details disclosed by children in the Dutch village and in a number of U.S. preschool cases was later to disturb a leading American authority on sexual abuse, Dr. Roland Summit. Speaking on Dutch television 2 years after the Udapakela case was dropped, the psychiatrist said, quote, "I am astounded that the case in Holland is identical to cases we have in this country. And by identical, I mean the otherwise bizarre things that the children describe, which we would all like to hope could not happen to children anywhere, have been described in detail by children in Holland and by children in 50 to 60 other cases throughout the United States. For example, I was amazed to hear that Udapakela children described costuming with the same kind of specificity as occurred here in America. Children in our cases described being involved with jungle animals as if they were riding on elephants, lions, and tigers. They describe grown-ups being dressed in costumes of clowns. Very often they describe numbers of black hooded people dressed in robes and involved in circular movements and chants, close quote. Neither Summit nor Jonkers could find a rational way of explaining this synchronization of disclosures from children at least 3,000 miles apart. Jonkers readily admitted the possibility of small-scale contamination of evidence within the Dutch village itself, though even this was not extensive enough to damage the independence of the testimony. But there was no possibility that American child survivors could have imposed their experience on children they did not know existed. Nor could the explanations have been contamination by adult professionals, police, or social workers exposed to the germ of ritual abuse information. One of the problems Jonkers faced, particularly in the early stages of the Satanic disclosures, was that neither he nor any of his colleagues had heard about ritual abuse, much less absorbed the precise details of its key indicators. One factor in this dismissal of the children's stories in Udapakela was the lack of unequivocal medical evidence of abuse. It puzzled Jonkers, too, that after 6 weeks of relatively fruitless official investigation, he conducted his own clinical study of reported symptoms among the 90 children. Quote, the supporters of the, quote, children's fantasy theory, close quote, had eagerly used the outcome of the limited official medical tests as, quote, proof that nothing had actually happened to the children. To acquire a more objective view, my wife and I decided to conduct a survey, which ultimately involved the parents of 90 children. This survey was held from the end of June to the beginning of July 1987, and in the course of this period, a number of behavioral changes became apparent both to parents and acquaintances. It should be made clear that the data gathered by my wife and myself does not claim to have absolute scientific values. It reflects the indicated tendencies rather than significant statistical data, close quote. The Jonkerses collected information from the children's parents about physical indications consistent with abuse and behavioral symptoms. Although they had never heard of Pamela Hudson, their limited study is similar to her pioneering work in California. Of the 90 children covered by the survey, In 17 cases, the parents could afterwards recall no physical signs indicative of abuse. For the rest, there was a visible pattern. 34 children had apparently displayed an unusual degree of bruising in abnormal places. 22 had inflamed genitalia. 21 experienced pain when urinating, and 18 found it extremely painful to defecate. The parents of 16 children had noticed inexplicable stains in their youngsters' underwear. 12 children had had inflamed anal areas. The psychological indicators were similarly revealing, with unusually high numbers of children reported as showing overdeveloped sexual behavior for their age, inappropriate feelings of shame about their genitals, sudden bedwetting, nightmares, disturbing previously normal sleep patterns, and inexplicable aggression or nervousness. The Jonkers were careful to note that such was the nature of the survey that alternate explanations could be found for all the physical and behavioral symptoms. This is, in fact, not unusual in the case of sexual abuse. Some anal scarring, for example, could be either evidence of sexual abuse or merely the result of severe constipation. Similarly, the doctors recognized that their study was potentially flawed by the fact that it asked parents to recall such symptoms after they had become aware of the possibility of sexual and/or ritual abuse in Uda Pakela. But the sheer weight of correlation between American key indicators of satanic abuse in America and the wholly separate results of the Junkers study raised once again the unanswerable question: how could two such communities independently arrive at the same conclusions? The formal verdict on the Uda Pakela affair was that it had been a case of mass hysteria. No arrests were ever made, no charges ever brought. Yet privately, the police admitted they were certain that at least 32 children had been abused and that a further 25 were likely to have been victims. In only 2 cases did the detectives rule out abuse altogether. And of course, no admissions were ever made as to whether the abuse had taken place during rituals, as the children alleged, or simply as part of an organized ring of pedophiles. Fred Jonkers and his wife, both physicians to the small village community, have no such doubts. Quote, in our opinion, sexual abuse of children took place on a large scale in Uda Pakela. This abuse was not limited to physical contact. A number of children were victims of ritual abuse. Our conviction is based upon the spontaneity with which the stories were told by the children and on the behavioral techniques we used. We took into account the nature of the data we acquired from potentially unstable or suggestible parents and the possibility of fake stories. Moreover, the specialist child psychiatrist sent to Uda Pakela by the Justice Department came here first as a disbeliever, but after conducting its investigation under the most strict requirements, he only confirmed our convictions, close quote. Why, given the weight of evidence, be it in Holland, Britain, or elsewhere, are children's matching disclosures of ritual abuse so abruptly dismissed? The American psychiatrist and child abuse specialist, Dr. Roland Summit, studied a number of ritual cases and came to a disturbing conclusion. Quote, there are a couple of issues in these ritual abuse cases that divide people and lead them to fight against belief. One is the description of pornography. The children describe being photographed in sexual and humiliating kinds of situations. People investigating expect, then, to find the pictures so that they will have proof. When the pictures aren't found, and somehow routinely the pictures are hidden or lost, people are likely to discredit everything else the children say because of their disappointment and anger at being led to expect physical evidence that isn't there. The second argument is even stronger. When the children describe being involved in murder, then people demand that there be missing people and they demand that there be bodies. When there is no direct corroboration of either of those, the children are punished. The children are blamed for lying when the proof doesn't emerge. My advice to those of you in Europe who have the opportunity to look at these cases for the first time is to try and profit from our mistakes in the United States. These are not generally cases which will be satisfactory to criminal tests of guilt. The first goal should not be to figure out who you're going to put in jail or who is going to be arrested for these crimes. People will fight over that and destroy any understanding of what might be happening to the children. The nature of this phenomenon seems to be that the people who are doing it are much too smart, much too well hidden, and much too aware of crowd process to risk being caught. They will take public concern and skepticism and turn it against the children and against those people who are trying to define the problem, so that the public itself becomes the enemy of discovery. Close quote. Summit, of course, is a child therapist and not a detective. Yet the painful lessons he and his colleagues have learned over more than 6 years of ritual abuse cases gave him the experience to recommend the safest path through the emerging European cases. Quote, I would suggest that someone take charge of finding out what happened to the children and learning why. Only then, after validating that such things really do happen and that there are people who have the knowledge and power to brainwash children into silence, only then can people use that intelligence to figure out how this can be stopped and who can be held responsible for it. Close quote. It is a lesson European law enforcement and much of the therapeutic community has yet to learn. Nor is this particularly surprising. In the reporting of ritual abuse, America led Europe and was led in its turn by Canada. As skeptics have been so keen to point out, most contemporary reporting of satanic crimes began when Michelle Smith met Dr. Lawrence Pasdar in British Columbia in 1976. How then has Canada coped? Children's Evidence, Canada. By the time Lawrence Pasdar finished coaxing the details of satanic ritual abuse from Michelle Smith's buried memories, the events themselves were almost 25 years distant. There was no remote possibility of any effective law enforcement response. To compensate for this, the psychiatrist and his patient fought for, and eventually won, the acceptance of their evidence by the Vatican. Armed with this religious endorsement, Pasdar set out to help educate police and therapists with a series of seminars and lectures throughout North America. It was to be 6 years before Canadian law enforcement had its chance to act on new allegations of satanic ritual abuse. The outcome, however, was unchanged. Erica and Jenny, the two sisters who had told their therapists in Hamilton, Ontario, of ritual abuse at the hands of their father, mother, and mother's boyfriend, exemplified between 1985 and 1987 the apparent impossibility of obtaining a successful outcome to such cases. In Canada, as in Britain, the emphasis in all abuse work was on a joint approach between the caregiving social workers and the investigative police teams. In the state of Ontario, the principal official child welfare agency is the Children's Aid Society. Its role, defined by statute law, is to determine a child's need for protection based upon its own investigation. The standard of proof required for CAS to take action, removing children from parental custody or limiting any access, is the civil law test of the balance of probabilities. So, in any hearing resulting from its actions, CAS is required to prove that a child's injuries, condition, or evidence of neglect was probably caused by the direct action or negligence of the adult who legally had custody and control at the time. The police, again, as in the UK, work to a different set of rules. Their mandate is to investigate and determine whether criminal charges of abuse can be laid under the Criminal Code of Canada, the admirably organized federal statute book. The standard of proof required is much higher than in civil cases. Police have to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the allegations against an individual are true. Although the theory says that both CAS and the police work together, there is no statutory duty on the police to investigate allegations of abuse made under or falling within the civil child protection legislation. It was a loophole that in 1985, CAS was to discover the hard way. Erica and Jenny were aged 7 and 4, respectively, when they were placed, with their mother's blessing, in the care of a respected and experienced foster mother by CAS. Shortly after they arrived, the girls told their foster mother that they had been sexually and physically abused, that they had been forced to participate in pornographic films, that they had witnessed and indeed been part of ritual killings, acts of bestiality, and cannibalism. According to Nancy McGillivray and Nora Dugan, CAS's supervisor and director of services at the time, the foster mother and social workers immediately set in train the established child abuse procedure. Quote, following the beginnings of the children's disclosures to the foster mother, the police were notified by the society and a joint child abuse investigation initiated. This included recorded interviews of the children by a child abuse specialist and the alleged perpetrators by the police, as well as the medical examination of the children. It quickly expanded to include in-depth psychiatric assessment of the children and their past and current caregivers, and a validation study of the children's statement by a team of child abuse experts, close quote. The medical tests proved relatively helpful to the children. Both Erica and Jenny had disclosed abuse of their vaginas and anuses by bananas, birds, feathers, and human flesh, all wielded by their mother and the two men. The CAS pediatrician confirmed that the limited degree of physical marks on the children's genitals was consistent with this type of abuse. Initially, the police were supportive. The detectives concerned gave every appearance of believing the two young girls, except insofar as they related to pornography and ritual abuse. Both of these topics were quickly placed off limits. From there on, the case, and with it Erica and Jenny, was doomed. According to Nancy McGillivray and Nora Dugan, quote, although the police, jointly with the CAS investigators, validated the sexual abuse of the children in the early stages, as the disclosures became more horrific with the allegations of ritual abuse, the veracity of the sexual abuse allegations became an issue. The overriding police premise was that the lack of proof for the former discredited the latter. This was also the main premise for the defense of the parents in the subsequent custody battle, and the investigating officers were used as defense witnesses. The general disbelief of the police was compounded by their insensitivity and lack of understanding of the process of disclosure by children and the effect on them. Safety and trust are crucial components to the disclosing process. Child victims will only disclose initially to adults they trust. The police officers were perceived by the children in this case as not believing them and, therefore, not to be trusted. Consequently, the attitude of the police impeded them from getting any direct statements from the children during the investigation. This was to be further exaggerated for the children in the open display of distrust and acrimony between the police and the CAS investigators. On an outing in search of graveyards described by the children in their disclosures of ritual abuse, the police secretly recorded all conversations between the social worker, the children, and themselves. This tape demonstrates clearly the officer's predisposition to disbelief, insensitivity to the children, and hostility to the social worker. Although the children were tenacious on that day, standing up to the hostile questions of the police, finally, exhausted, they recanted. Close quote. As we shall see in the next chapter, the pattern of events in Hamilton, Ontario during 1985 was to be repeated almost step for step in Nottingham, England 2 years later. In McGillivray and Dugan's view, quote, the police inability to secure either direct statements from the children or physical evidence of ritual abuse drew the police to the conclusion that sexual abuse had likely not occurred, that the allegations of ritual abuse and pornography were not to be believed, and that they were, in a large part, the result of gullible and manipulative social workers. Consequently, the entire criminal investigation took on a bias of disbelief, with the police trying to negate both the known and future allegations of the children. This breakdown had far-reaching effects, as illustrated by the refusal formally to respond when the foster parents reported a life-threatening plot against them, which had been relayed by the children. Close quote. To be fair to the detectives, Canadian law played a significant part in their initial decision that there was not sufficient evidence for a successful criminal prosecution. At that time, though Statute C-15 subsequently modified the presumption, hearsay evidence was not admissible in abuse cases, and child victims were required to take the stand, testify under oath, and be cross-examined if there was no other corroborative evidence. The hearsay evidence, as in so many cases throughout the world, comprised the children's disclosures to their foster mother. With this excluded, and with the court-appointed psychologists refusing to allow the children to give evidence for fear of further trauma, criminal proceedings stood no chance of success. Nonetheless, nothing excuses the complete disintegration of the relationship between CAS and the police, nor the vicious polarization of their respective attitudes. So bad did the breakdown become that there was no sharing of information between the two investigative teams, and the police either refused to supply or attempted to block access to vital information that they had gleaned, including that relating to a curious fire at a television studio which destroyed all its records. The children had alleged that they had been abused and filmed there. In the final custody case, CAS's lawyer was forced into the absurd position of being forced to have the investigating detectives listed as hostile witnesses. It was the only way he could get information out of them under cross-examination. CAS also began, but later withdrew, a contempt of court action against its police partners in the, quote, joint investigation, close quote. Although the case of Erica and Jenny can now be seen in some lights as a victory for the common sense approach to ritual abuse, Judge Thomas Becket deciding that the allegations of ritual mattered primarily because the children believed them to be true, it also shows how the judicial process in such cases fails every individual involved. Erica and Jenny had asked to be allowed to go home when all the nasties was sorted out. This was rendered impossible. The girl's mother, who, it emerged during the hearings, had been severely sexually and ritually abused as a child herself, never obtained the therapy she needed so badly. Neither did her husband or boyfriend. The foster mother was put under immense strain and constantly attacked by lawyers for the parents. Because of the discovery of a plot to kill her, Erica and Jenny were taken away from her home and placed in a more secure location. They lost the first adult they had learned to trust. She lost the reason she had been caught up in the case in the first place. The working relationship between the therapists and the police was holed below the waterline. Neither could go forward to handle future joint cases in any confidence. It would take several years to repair the damage. Although Judge Becket praised and supported the CAS evidence and techniques, within a year of the case ending, every one of the social work investigators left child welfare for less stressful employment. Behind this catalog of misery and missed opportunity lay one thing: a refusal to contemplate the reality of ritual abuse. That refusal has underpinned policing not merely in Canada, but throughout the Western world, even in the one country to take child abuse seriously as an international problem, America.